What if one phone call could change your life forever? What if the choice you made in that moment didn't just define who you are, but cost you everything? This is the story of Akio Takahashi, a Japanese millionaire who had it all: money, power, influence. But when his own mother, desperate and broken, reached out to him for help, he turned his back on her. What happened next? Stay with me, because this story will make you question everything you think you know about success, family, and pride. Akio Takahashi was the kind of man you read about in Forbes or see featured on financial podcasts. At just 35, he wasn't just a millionaire, he was a legend on Wall Street. Known for his razor-sharp instincts and fearless investments in cutting-edge tech, Akio could turn a failing startup into a billion-dollar empire with a single deal. But behind the headlines and glamorous success stories, Akio was a man shaped by a past he desperately wanted to erase. Born in a tiny, one-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood of Tokyo, Akio didn't grow up with privilege. His mother, Kimiko, worked tirelessly as a seamstress, often taking on double shifts just to put food on the table. His father? Long gone, leaving Kimiko to raise Akio on her own. Life was hard, and money was always tight. But Kimiko had one dream for her son: to give him the education and opportunities she never had, no matter what it took. And Akio didn't disappoint. From an early age, he was a prodigy with numbers. While other kids played soccer in the streets, Akio was solving complex math problems and winning school competitions. By the time he was 18, he had earned a full scholarship to one of Japan's most prestigious universities. It was a proud moment for Kimiko, though Akio barely acknowledged her sacrifices. To him, her struggles were a reminder of everything he wanted to leave behind. After graduating at the top of his class, Akio's talent caught the attention of a top investment firm in New York City. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. With a suitcase in one hand and an unwavering determination in the other, he left Japan and never looked back. New York welcomed him like it does every ambitious dreamer, with challenges, competition, and endless possibilities. But unlike many, Akio thrived. In just a few short years, he went from being an ambitious intern to running his own investment firm, commanding billions in assets. By the time Akio was 30, he had it all: luxury cars, designer suits, a penthouse overlooking Central Park, and connections to the most powerful people in the financial world. He was the picture of success, the kind of man others envied and admired. But with each step up the ladder, something changed in Akio. He began to see his humble beginnings not as a badge of honor, but as a weakness. The struggling single mother who had sacrificed everything for him became, in his mind, a part of his life he wanted to bury. Kimiko, though proud of her son, felt the growing distance between them. The calls became less frequent, and when they did happen, they were short and transactional. She didn't complain. She never wanted to be a burden. Instead, she sent him letters, always filled with the same words of encouragement and pride. But Akio rarely read them. To him, his mother's simple life in Japan was a world he had outgrown. Little did Akio know, the very foundation of his empire, the success he prided himself on, was built on shaky ground. His relentless ambition had blinded him to what truly mattered. And as he continued to rise, he couldn't see the storm brewing on the horizon, a storm that would soon sweep away everything he had worked so hard to build. Akio's life in New York was a whirlwind of success and luxury, but far away in a small apartment in Tokyo, his mother Kimiko was facing a reality he could no longer relate to. She had lived in the same cramped apartment for decades, surrounded by memories of raising her son on her own. But those walls, which once symbolized perseverance, were now closing in on her. Kimiko had just received an eviction notice. Her landlord had sold the building to developers, and she had 30 days to leave. For the first time in years, she felt truly helpless. She had no savings to fall back on and no one else to turn to, except Akio. It had taken Kimiko days to build up the courage to call her son. She knew how busy he was, how distant he'd become over the years. But as she sat on her tatami mat, clutching the eviction notice in her trembling hands, she realized she had no choice. When Akio finally answered, his voice was cold and detached, as if she were just another business call. "What is it, mother?" he asked, not even a hint of warmth in his tone. Kimiko took a deep breath and explained her situation, her voice breaking as she described how she had nowhere else to go. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. For a moment, Kimiko thought her son might actually understand the gravity of her situation. But when Akio finally spoke, his words cut like a knife. "I've already done enough for you. You need to take responsibility for your own life." Kimiko was stunned. She had never asked him for much, never complained about the distance he had put between them, and now, in her most desperate moment, her own son was rejecting her. Tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to reason with him. "Akio, please. I've always been proud of you. I've never wanted to be a burden, but I have no one else to turn to." Her voice cracked, but Akio remained unmoved. "I'm sorry, Mother, but I can't help you right now," he said coldly before hanging up. The click of the phone was like a final door slamming shut between them. Kimiko sat in silence, staring at the receiver in her hand. She felt a pain deeper than any she had known before, not just because of her eviction, but because the boy she had sacrificed everything for was now a stranger to her. She didn't resent him. She never could. But she couldn't shake the feeling of heartbreak. In her eyes, Akio had become so consumed by his success that he had forgotten what truly mattered. Meanwhile, Akio went about his life as if nothing had happened. He didn't feel guilt, only annoyance at the interruption. To him, this was just another example of why he needed to distance himself from the past. What he didn't realize, however, was that this seemingly small decision would set off a chain of events that would bring his carefully constructed empire crashing down. Kimiko's eviction day came, and with nowhere to go, she was forced to move into a local shelter. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. She kept hoping Akio would call, that he would realize how much she needed him. But the days turned into weeks, and the phone never rang. Kimiko's love for her son remained, but her heart grew heavy with sorrow. And for Akio, the consequences of that fateful phone call were already on their way. He just didn't know it yet. Akio had no idea that his decision to hang up on his mother would become the first crack in the foundation of his seemingly perfect life. To him, it was just another day, a routine call he had dismissed, an interruption that didn't deserve a second thought. He returned to his penthouse that evening, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and scrolled through updates on his latest investments. The world was at his feet, or so he thought. But far away, in the shadows of Tokyo's bustling streets, the consequences of his coldness were quietly taking shape. Back in Japan, Kimiko had no choice but to leave the apartment she had called home for so many years. The shelter she moved into was cramped, filled with strangers, and stripped her of the dignity she had spent her entire life protecting. Yet, even in this new and difficult reality, Kimiko's spirit remained kind. She spent her days helping others at the shelter, folding clothes, preparing meals, and lending a listening ear to those who had lost even more than she had. Her resilience was inspiring, but her body was growing weaker, a reality she kept hidden from those around her. Unbeknownst to Akio, Kimiko wasn't entirely alone. A childhood friend of Akio's, Hiroshi Sato, had learned about her eviction and began visiting her at the shelter. Hiroshi had grown up alongside Akio in Tokyo, but while Akio left for the bright lights of New York, Hiroshi stayed behind to fight for the rights of the working class. He was an outspoken activist and had become a thorn in the side of powerful developers whose funding, Hiroshi would soon discover, traced back to Akio's investment firm. It didn't take long for Hiroshi to connect the dots. The same developers who had evicted Kimiko and dozens of other families in Tokyo were being backed by Takahashi Capital, Akio's firm. Furious at the betrayal, Hiroshi tried reaching out to Akio directly. He sent emails, left voicemails, and even contacted Akio's assistant, but every message went unanswered. To Hiroshi, this wasn't just about business, it was personal. How could the boy who grew up eating simple meals at Kimiko's table now profit from her suffering? While Hiroshi worked tirelessly to expose the truth, Akio's life in New York began to feel off. It started with small things, a few deals falling through, investors expressing doubt, and a vague sense that something wasn't quite right. At first, he brushed it off as bad luck. But then, one morning, he woke up to an email that sent a chill down his spine. It was from Hiroshi. The subject line read, "You've turned your back on your own blood." The message inside was short but scathing. Your mother is living in a shelter because of you. How much more will you sacrifice for your precious empire? Akio ignored the email, telling himself it was just an attempt to guilt him. But the words lingered in the back of his mind, creeping in during quiet moments. He began to feel a faint unease, though he couldn't put his finger on why. What he didn't know was that Hiroshi wasn't going to stop at emails. Hiroshi was preparing to go public, and when he did, it would shatter the carefully curated image Akio had spent years building. Meanwhile, Kimiko's health was deteriorating. She hadn't told anyone, not even Hiroshi, about the sharp pains in her chest or the dizziness that left her struggling to stand. She didn't want to be a burden, even in her weakest moments. She still believed deep down that Akio would come around, that her son, despite his coldness, would remember the boy who used to sit beside her, eating homemade miso soup and dreaming of a better life. But time was running out. For both Kimiko and the empire Akio had built on pride, ambition, and the ties he had so carelessly severed. Akio's world was about to be turned upside down, but he didn't know it yet. He was still sitting comfortably in his sleek Manhattan office, reviewing projections for his next big deal, unaware that a storm was brewing halfway across the world. While he sipped his designer coffee and signed million-dollar contracts, Hiroshi Sato was in Tokyo preparing to expose the truth. And this time, Hiroshi wasn't just fighting for Kimiko, he was fighting for every family who had been displaced by Akio's greed. Hiroshi's plan began with a press conference. Standing in front of reporters with a stack of documents in hand, he laid it all bare. The evictions, the redevelopment projects, and the funding trail that led straight to Takahashi Capital. But the bombshell wasn't just about business, it was personal. Hiroshi told the reporters about Kimiko, the elderly woman now living in a shelter, abandoned by her own son. The story spread like wildfire across Japan, and within hours it made its way to international media. Headlines read, "Millionaire investor profits off his mother's suffering, and son turns his back on the woman who raised him." In New York, Akio's phone wouldn't stop ringing. At first, he thought it was a typical business day, but when he saw the messages piling up, his stomach sank. Reporters were calling for comments. Investors wanted explanations. Even his closest colleagues were texting him with questions he didn't know how to answer. He quickly searched his name online, and the headlines hit him like a punch to the gut. There it was, his face plastered across every major news outlet, alongside images of his mother sitting in a crowded shelter in Tokyo. Panic set in. Akio immediately called his PR team, demanding they handle the situation. "Spin it," he ordered. "Say it's fake news. Say she refused my help." But no matter how hard they tried, the damage had already been done. The media was relentless, and so were the protesters who had begun gathering outside Takahashi Capital's headquarters in New York. They carried signs that read, "Family over fortune," and "How could you forget your own mother?" The crowd grew larger every day, and Akio started avoiding the office altogether, terrified of being confronted. As the backlash intensified, so did the fallout. Investors began pulling out of deals, citing concerns over Akio's ethics. Longtime partners started distancing themselves from his firm, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. And then came the lawsuits. Former employees and business rivals seized the opportunity to come forward with accusations of shady practices within Takahashi Capital. The empire Akio had spent years building was crumbling, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But the public exposure didn't just hurt Akio professionally, it struck a deeper, more personal chord. As the days went by, he found himself staring at the photos of his mother in the news, unable to escape the guilt that was now suffocating him. He remembered the nights she stayed up sewing clothes to pay for his textbooks, the mornings she woke up early to pack his lunches, and the proud smile on her face when he graduated. How had he let himself drift so far from the person she had raised him to be? In Tokyo, Kimiko was unaware of the chaos unfolding around her son. She continued to live quietly in the shelter, helping others in small but meaningful ways. When someone showed her the news articles about Akio, she simply nodded and said, "I only hope he remembers who he really is." But deep down, her heart ached. Despite everything, she still loved her son. She still hoped he would find his way back, not just to her, but to himself. And while Akio's public image was in ruins, he was beginning to realize that his real downfall wasn't about money or reputation. It was about something far greater: the family he had left behind. Akio had been avoiding the media storm for weeks. His once busy penthouse, where high-profile clients and investors used to gather, now felt like a lonely fortress. Curtains drawn, phone on silent, and his laptop closed. He was doing everything he could to shut out the world. But no amount of isolation could quiet the gnawing guilt that had taken root in his heart. Every night he'd pour himself a glass of whiskey and sit in silence, haunted by the image of his mother's face in the news. And then, one night, his phone buzzed with a message that would change everything. The message was from Hiroshi. Akio hadn't heard from him since the email accusing him of abandoning his mother. At first, he considered ignoring it like he had before. But something about the subject line stopped him cold. "Your mother is in the hospital." His hands trembled as he opened the message. The text was brief but devastating. "Kimiko collapsed at the shelter. It's serious. If you care at all, you need to come now." For the first time in years, Akio felt a wave of fear that couldn't be ignored. He sat frozen, staring at the screen, before finally booking a flight to Tokyo. The flight was long, but Akio barely noticed the time passing. His mind was racing with memories he had tried so hard to bury. He thought of his mother's laughter as she helped him with his homework, the way she always made sure he had enough to eat, even when it meant going without herself. He realized too late how much she had sacrificed for him. By the time the plane touched down in Tokyo, guilt had consumed him entirely. He knew he had to see her, to apologize, to make things right, if there was still time. When Akio arrived at the hospital, Hiroshi was waiting for him in the corridor. The look on his face told Akio everything he needed to know. "She's gone," Hiroshi said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow. Akio felt the words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. He staggered back, his vision blurring, as the weight of his mother's death crushed him. She was gone, and he hadn't even had the chance to say goodbye. The nurse handed Akio a small box containing Kimiko's belongings. Inside, he found a few simple items: her favorite scarf, a photograph of the two of them from his graduation, and a worn notebook. As he opened the notebook, his chest tightened. It was filled with letters Kimiko had written to him over the years, letters she had never sent. Each one began with words of love and pride, and ended with a hope that he was happy and healthy. Flipping through the pages, Akio's tears fell freely. She had never stopped loving him, even when he had turned his back on her. Hiroshi stood silently as Akio clutched the box, his head bowed in shame. After a long moment, Hiroshi finally spoke. "She never blamed you, you know. Even at the end, she only wished for your happiness." Akio couldn't hold back the sobs that racked his body. All the wealth, power, and influence he had built meant nothing now. He had lost the one person who had loved him unconditionally, and there was no way to undo the damage he had caused. Akio stayed in Tokyo for the funeral, standing at the back of the small service as the shelter residents and a few old neighbors said their goodbyes. For the first time in his life, he felt truly alone. His empire, his fortune, his reputation, none of it mattered anymore. As he stared at his mother's modest grave, a single thought echoed in his mind. He had spent his entire life chasing success, only to realize far too late that he had already lost the greatest treasure he'd ever had. After the funeral, Akio returned to New York, but nothing felt the same. The grand penthouse that once felt like a symbol of his success now felt suffocating. Every corner seemed to echo with reminders of his failures, not as a businessman, but as a son. The guilt of losing his mother weighed on him, but it wasn't just the personal loss that haunted him. His professional life, the empire he had spent years building, was crumbling faster than he could comprehend. The scandal surrounding his abandonment of Kimiko had spread far and wide, and his reputation was now in ruins. Investors were fleeing in droves. The backlash from the public was relentless, with hashtags like Forgotten Mother and Akio Takahashi Fall trending daily. Protesters didn't just target his offices, they started showing up at his home, shouting through megaphones and carrying signs. The financial world, once his playground, had turned its back on him. No one wanted to associate with the man whose greed and pride had not only hurt his family, but also symbolized everything wrong with unchecked ambition. But the fallout didn't stop there. Former employees began speaking out, sharing stories of Akio's ruthless behavior in the workplace. Deals that had seemed airtight were suddenly collapsing as partners withdrew their support. Lawsuits began piling up, claims of unethical practices, negligence, and even fraud. For years, Akio had operated with an arrogance that made him believe he was untouchable. Now, everything he had worked for was unraveling at the seams. As the financial pressure mounted, Akio was forced to make difficult decisions. First, he sold his penthouse, then his luxury cars. The offices of Takahashi Capital, once bustling with activity, were eerily silent as employees were laid off and floors were emptied. Eventually, the firm declared bankruptcy. The empire that had taken a decade to build was gone in a matter of months. Akio, once the golden boy of Wall Street, was now just another cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. But perhaps the hardest part for Akio wasn't losing the money or the power. It was losing his sense of identity. For so long, his wealth had defined him. It was the armor he wore to protect himself from the pain of his past, the validation he sought to prove he had made it. Without it, he was forced to confront the man he had become, cold, disconnected, and consumed by pride. And as he reflected on the choices he had made, one truth became painfully clear. None of it had been worth losing his mother. With nowhere else to go, Akio disappeared from the public eye. Rumors spread about his whereabouts. Some said he had moved back to Japan, living humbly in a quiet fishing village. Others claimed he spent his days volunteering at shelters, trying to atone for the harm he had caused. The truth, however, was that Akio was still searching for a way to forgive himself, to find meaning in a life that now felt so empty. In the end, Akio's fall wasn't just about losing his fortune or his reputation. It was about losing sight of what truly mattered. His story became a lesson for those who chase success at any cost, a reminder that wealth means nothing without love and connection. And though Akio's future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. The man who had once ruled Wall Street would never be the same again. Akio's story isn't just about the rise and fall of a millionaire. It's about the choices we make and the people we sometimes forget along the way. It's a reminder that no amount of money, no level of success can ever replace the love and support of those who truly care for us. His empire may have crumbled, but the real tragedy was losing the chance to tell his mother what she meant to him while she was still here. How many of us get so caught up in our ambitions, our routines, or even our pride that we neglect the people who matter most? How often do we assume they'll always be there, waiting until one day they're gone? Akio's story teaches us a painful but important lesson. Love and gratitude are not things to save for later. They're meant to be shared now, while we still can. So take a moment. Call your parents, hug your siblings, thank a friend who's been there for you. Let them know how much they mean to you. Don't wait for tomorrow, because sometimes tomorrow never comes. And now I want to hear from you. What's your takeaway from Akio's story? Has it made you reflect on your own relationships or decisions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your insights mean so much to this community. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps us reach more people with stories like this. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel is all about stories that move you, inspire you, and sometimes even make you cry. Join us and let's keep sharing these powerful lessons together. Thank you for watching and for being part of this journey. Take care of yourself and take care of the ones you love. See you in the next story.